investment. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I'm really glad you're here today because we're going to talk about something that, in my opinion, investment is one of the most important developments happening around Iraq right now, and surprisingly, most people aren't even noticing it. Before we get into everything, investment, quick disclaimer, like always, this is not financial advice. I'm not giving you dates, I'm not giving you rates, and none of this should be taken as investment guidance. Investment, what we do here is look at information, policy shifts, economic signals, and global financial trends, and we talk about possible scenarios. That's it. Investment. Always do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about something that has quietly started happening with Iraq. Investment. Something that doesn't look dramatic at first glance, but if you really step back and look at the bigger picture, investment. It actually suggests that Iraq may be changing direction in a very meaningful way. And the interesting part is most people are still looking in the wrong place. Investment, a lot of people in the Dinar community focus almost entirely on exchange rates. They watch the numbers, they refresh the screens, investment, and they wait for some kind of big headline or announcement. But in reality, currency movements are usually the final stage of a much larger process. Investment. Before the currency changes, the country itself has to change. Policies change. Financial systems evolve. International relationships shift. Investment, and when those deeper layers begin moving, the currency eventually reflects that transformation. So when we say Iraq may have changed direction, investment, we're not talking about a single announcement or some sudden event. We're talking about a gradual shift in strategy that has been building over time. Investment. Over the past several years, Iraq has been working through a long list of reforms that on the surface may not seem very exciting. Banking modernization, investment, anti-corruption efforts, digital payment systems, new financial regulations, partnerships with international institutions. For a lot of people watching from the outside, investment, these things might look like routine government activity. But in the world of international finance, investment, these are actually the kinds of changes that signal a country is preparing for a different economic future. Let me give you an example. Investment. Imagine you're renovating an old building. Before you open it to the public, you have to replace the wiring, update the plumbing, reinforce the structure. Investment. And make sure everything meets modern safety standards. None of that work is glamorous. Nobody throws a party when the electrical system gets upgraded. Investment. But without those upgrades, the building can't function properly. That's very similar to what Iraq has been doing with its financial system. The central bank, investment. The government and international partners have been working to rebuild trust in the banking sector, strengthen financial oversight, investment, and connect Iraq more closely with global financial networks. Now, here's where the direction change begins to show up. For many years, Iraq's economic strategy was focused almost entirely on stability. After decades of war, sanctions, and internal conflict, stability was the #1 priority. Investment, the goal was simply to keep the system functioning, keep inflation under control, and maintain basic economic balance. But recently, investment, the conversation coming out of Iraq has started shifting. Instead of only talking about stability, officials have increasingly been talking about development, investment, and integration with global markets. That might sound like a small difference in wording, but in economic terms, it's actually a very big shift. Investment. A stability-focused economy is defensive. It tries to prevent problems. A growth-focused economy is proactive. It tries to create opportunities. Investment. And when you start hearing government officials, financial leaders, and economic advisors talking more about growth than survival, investment. It usually means the country believes it's ready to move into the next stage of development. Investment. Another signal that supports this idea is the push toward modern banking infrastructure inside Iraq. For a long time, Iraq operated largely as a cash-based society. Investment. Many transactions were handled outside the formal banking system, which made it difficult to track money flows, enforce regulations, and build financial transparency. Investment. That kind of environment creates challenges for international investors. Large global institutions want to operate in systems where transactions are traceable, regulations are enforced, and financial data is reliable. Without those conditions, it's very difficult for major investment capital to enter a market. Investment. So one of the biggest things Iraq has been working on is bringing more of its economy into the official banking system. Digital payment platforms have been expanding. Investment, electronic salary payments for government employees have been increasing. Banks have been pushed to adopt stronger compliance standards. Investment. These changes may sound technical, but they represent a fundamental transformation in how money moves inside the country. Investment. And when a country modernizes its financial infrastructure like this, it opens doors that weren't available before. Investment. It becomes easier to attract international partnerships. It becomes easier to facilitate cross-border trade. Investment. And it becomes easier for the national currency to operate within the global financial system. Now let's pause for a moment and think about something important. Investment. If Iraq were planning to keep its economy operating the same way it did 20 years ago, investment, there would be very little reason to invest so heavily in these types of financial reforms. Why spend years modernizing the banking system if the long-term plan is simply to maintain the status quo? The answer is simple. Investment, because the status quo is no longer the plan. Another area where we can see this change in direction is Iraq's approach to international partnerships. In the past, Iraq's economic relationships were somewhat limited and heavily dependent on a few key sectors, especially oil. Investment. Oil revenues still play a massive role in the Iraqi economy, but there's been increasing discussion about diversifying beyond that single resource. Investment. We've seen talks about infrastructure development, transportation corridors, regional trade networks, and industrial investment zones. Investment. All of these initiatives point toward a broader vision where Iraq becomes not just an oil exporter, but a regional economic hub connecting multiple markets. Investment. Think about Iraq's geographic position for a moment. It sits right in the middle of several major economic regions, the Gulf states, Turkey, Iran, investment, and the wider Middle East. That location creates enormous potential for trade routes, energy distribution, and logistics networks. Investment. If Iraq can successfully develop infrastructure that connects those regions, it could become one of the most important transit and trade centers in the region. Investment. And if that happens, the financial system supporting that trade will have to evolve as well. Currencies often gain strength not just because of government policy, investment, but because of economic activity. When more trade flows through a country, demand for its currency can grow naturally as businesses need it for transactions. Investment. So if Iraq's leadership is positioning the country as a regional connector for trade and energy, investment, that strategy could eventually influence how the dinar functions in the broader economic landscape. But again, and this is important, none of this happens overnight. Investment, large economic transformations are usually slow, complicated processes that unfold over many years. Investment. But when you start seeing multiple pieces of the puzzle moving in the same direction, banking reform, digital payments, infrastructure planning, investment, international partnerships, it begins to suggest something bigger is happening behind the scenes. Investment. It suggests the country may be shifting from a survival mindset to a development mindset. And that kind of transition can change everything over time. Investment. There's also a psychological factor involved in all of this. Global investors don't just analyze numbers, they analyze narratives. Investment. They look at the story a country is telling about its future. If the narrative is one of instability, corruption, and uncertainty, investors stay away. Investment. But if the narrative starts shifting toward modernization, transparency, and growth, the entire perception of that country begins to change. Investment. Iraq has been slowly trying to reshape that narrative through financial reforms, anti-corruption campaigns, and efforts to rebuild international relationships. Investment. The country has been signaling that it wants to move beyond its past and build a different economic future. Now, that doesn't mean the challenges are gone. Investment. Iraq still faces political disagreements, infrastructure limitations, and economic pressures that need to be managed carefully. But the direction appears to be shifting. Investment. Instead of simply trying to maintain stability, Iraq may now be trying to position itself for expansion. And when countries reach that point, investment, when they begin focusing on growth instead of recovery, that's when the financial world starts paying closer attention. Investment. Because history has shown that when a country with large natural resources, a strategic geographic location, investment, and a young population begins modernizing its financial system, the long-term economic potential can be significant. But again, the key word here is potential. Nothing is guaranteed. Economic reforms can succeed or fail depending on how they're implemented and how global conditions evolve. Investment. What we're seeing right now is not the final result. What we're seeing is the early stage of a possible new direction. Investment. Sometimes the most important moments in economic history are the ones that happen quietly, before the headlines, before the markets react. investment. And before the world fully realizes what's changing, that's where things start getting really interesting. Investment. Because in the next section, we're going to look at another layer of this story, investment. The signals coming from the international financial system and why they might suggest that Iraq's shift in direction is part of a much larger global picture. Investment. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. And before we keep going, just a quick reminder, like always, this is not financial advice. I'm not giving you dates. Investment. I'm not giving you rates, and none of this should be taken as investment guidance. What we're doing here is looking at developments, policies, investment, and financial signals surrounding Iraq and the global economy. And we're talking about possible scenarios and what they could mean. Investment. Always do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Investment. Now, earlier we talked about how Iraq appears to be shifting from a survival-focused economy to something more forward-looking. Investment, a country that may be positioning itself for development, investment, and deeper integration with global markets. That kind of shift doesn't always happen loudly. Investment. In fact, most of the time it happens quietly through policy changes, banking reforms, and infrastructure planning. But here's the part that gets even more interesting. Investment. When a country starts changing direction economically, you can often see clues not just inside the country, investment, but also in the way the international financial system begins interacting with it. And that's exactly what some observers have started noticing. Investment. One of the most important pieces of the puzzle is how Iraq has been working to align its financial system with international standards. This may sound technical, investment, but it's actually one of the most critical steps any country must take if it wants to operate smoothly in global markets. For many years, investment. Iraq's financial system struggled with transparency issues, outdated banking practices, and limited connectivity with international payment networks. Investment. That created barriers for foreign investment and made it difficult for global institutions to fully engage with Iraqi markets. But over time, investment. We've started to see serious efforts to change that. Banks have been pushed to adopt stronger compliance measures. Anti-money laundering protocols have been strengthened. Electronic payment systems have expanded. And the central bank has been working closely with international financial organizations to improve oversight and stability. Investment. Why does that matter? Because global financial systems are built on trust and compliance. When international investors move billions of dollars across borders, investment, they need to know that the financial infrastructure they're interacting with meets certain standards. If a country's banking sector is considered unreliable or opaque, investment, large institutions simply won't participate. So before Iraq can fully step into a larger role in the global economy, its financial system has to meet those expectations. Investment, and step by step, that's exactly what it seems to be doing. Now, here's where things get really interesting. When financial systems begin aligning with global standards, investment, it doesn't just improve domestic stability, it also opens doors for deeper connections with international markets, trade financing, investment flows, investment, and cross-border payment systems. In other words, it allows the country to play a bigger role economically. Let's talk about trade for a moment. Investment, because trade is one of the biggest forces shaping currency dynamics around the world. Currencies don't exist in a vacuum. Investment, their strength and usefulness often depend on how much economic activity flows through the countries that issue them. When a nation becomes an important trade hub, investment. Demand for its currency can increase naturally because businesses need it for transactions, contracts, and investments. Now think about Iraq's geographic position again. Investment, it sits at a crossroads between several major economic regions, the Gulf states, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and the wider Middle East. Investment, that location has enormous potential for trade routes, transportation corridors, and energy distribution networks. And recently, investment. There have been increasing discussions about major development projects designed to take advantage of that location. Transportation corridors connecting ports to inland trade routes. Logistics hubs designed to move goods between regions. Investment, energy infrastructure linking multiple countries together. These kinds of projects don't just improve infrastructure, they reshape economic geography. Investment, if Iraq becomes a central connector between different markets, the volume of trade moving through the country could increase significantly over time. Investment. And whenever trade expands, financial systems have to evolve alongside it. Banks have to facilitate transactions. Currencies have to move efficiently. Investment. Payment networks have to handle larger volumes of activity. investment. So when you see a country investing heavily in trade infrastructure while simultaneously modernizing its banking system, it often signals a coordinated strategy. Investment, a strategy aimed at transforming the country into something more economically influential. Another factor that supports this idea is Iraq's increasing focus on financial technology and digital payments. For decades, much of Iraq's economy operated in cash. Investment, while cash-based systems can function on a basic level, they limit transparency and make it difficult to track financial activity across the entire economy. Investment, modern economies rely heavily on digital financial systems because they allow governments, banks, investment, and businesses to monitor transactions more efficiently and enforce regulations more effectively. Investment. That's why many countries around the world have been rapidly expanding digital payment platforms and electronic banking services. Investment. Iraq appears to be moving in that direction as well. Electronic salary systems for government workers have expanded. Investment. Payment cards and digital wallets have been introduced to more parts of the population. Banks are increasingly adopting modern transaction tracking technologies. Investment. These changes may seem routine, but they represent a major shift in how the financial system operates. When more transactions move through formal digital channels, investment, the government gains better visibility into economic activity, tax collection becomes more efficient, financial planning becomes more accurate. Investment, and perhaps most importantly, international investors feel more comfortable operating within that environment, because the more transparent a financial system becomes, investment, the easier it is for global institutions to participate. Now imagine what happens when you combine all of these developments together. Investment, a country modernizing its banking system, expanding digital financial infrastructure, developing major trade corridors, strengthening international partnerships. Investment, those are not random events. They look much more like pieces of a long-term economic strategy. Investment. There's also something happening on the psychological side of the market that's worth paying attention to. For many years, investment. Iraq was viewed primarily through the lens of conflict and instability. Investors saw risk first and opportunity second, but narratives can change over time. Investment. When countries implement reforms, rebuild infrastructure, and strengthen institutions, global perception gradually shifts. Investment. Investors start looking at the country not just as a risk, but as a potential opportunity. And perception plays a huge role in financial markets. Investment. If enough investors begin believing that a country's long-term outlook is improving, capital can start flowing into that market faster than many people expect. Investment. This is something we've seen happen in other parts of the world as well. Investment. Countries that were once considered unstable have transformed themselves into major investment destinations after implementing the right economic reforms. Now, Iraq is still in the middle of its transformation and challenges remain. Political disagreements, economic fluctuations, investment, and regional tensions can all influence the pace of progress, but the direction appears to be shifting. Instead of simply trying to maintain the status quo, Iraq seems to be laying the foundation for something larger, a more connected economy, a more modern financial system, investment, and potentially a more influential role in regional trade. And when countries begin moving in that direction, investment. The ripple effects can eventually reach their currencies as well, not always immediately and not always in the dramatic way people expect, but gradually investment as the economic structure supporting the currency becomes stronger. Now, this brings us to one more piece of the puzzle that doesn't get talked about enough. Investment, how global financial markets tend to react when structural changes like these begin aligning. Because once the infrastructure policies, investment, and economic momentum start moving together, markets often respond in ways that catch a lot of people off guard. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next.